Welcome to Win-Loss 101. This is the second week of this 6-week program. We're so excited to have you here today. Today, my guest, I'm Nate Bagley. I'm the host of Win-Loss 101. I'm going to be the consistent person on camera every single week, introducing you to all of our special thought leaders and guests. And today, we have Jonathan Stevens, who's the VP of Consulting here at Clozd, and we have Lauren Beall, who is a senior consultant. And between the two of them, they have done thousands of buyer interviews. They have guided several win-loss programs for companies in many different industries, and they are incredibly knowledgeable in the win-loss space. And I'm so glad that you guys are here. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Nate.
Yeah, thanks, Nate.
We're excited to learn from you today. So before we kick off the actual deep dive into our topic today, I wanted to cover a couple of just housekeeping items. First, if you are tuning in live, we can interact with you via the comments on LinkedIn and YouTube. So if you want to drop in the comments and let us know where you're from, you're also throughout the conversation today, if you have any questions that you want us to dive into and answer for you, feel free to leave those, and we'll have a Q&A portion at the end of today's call. And then just another quick reminder, if you go to winloss101.com, we have some really awesome bonus resources that are available for you that are not available just watching on the free live stream if you're watching on LinkedIn and YouTube. So head over to winloss101.com, either right now or after this is all over. And today specifically, we have a free, what would we call it? Like
deliverable.
A deliverable. It's like an interview guide template.
Job aid, maybe.
Yeah.
Or interview guide aid.
Yeah. So today we're going to be teaching you how to build your first interview guide, and we put together a couple of really awesome questions to help you get started on that homework assignment. So go to Win-Loss 101 to pick that up. And then just as a follow-up from last week, if you were here with us for the very first session of Win-Loss 101, the homework assignment was to pick a revenue problem that you want to investigate and research over the 6-week program, over the next 5 weeks. And we would love to hear from you, hear what revenue problem it is that you plan to tackle. So feel free to drop that in the comments as well. We'd love to see what you've got going on. One more story that I kind of came up with this week, I thought of an analogy to describe why win-loss analysis is so important. In the world of like sales and marketing, there are a lot of amazing tools to help practitioners, to help professionals be more efficient, be more effective, to stay organized, to plan, to automate, and to overall just like be better at their jobs, right? Yeah. There's a lot of these softwares and a lot of these tools out there. And I liken that analogy to kind of like having a fitness program. If you want to be in shape, if you want to be really healthy, you have to do a couple of things and do them pretty consistently to be really in shape. You got to go to the gym and exercise. You got to eat healthy. You got to drink lots of water. You got to get sleep, take your vitamins. And those are the things that help you be more efficient at life, have more energy, and operate at your like peak performance, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like a lot of these tools are what sales and marketing organizations use to get themselves there. But a couple of years ago, I was like really into the gym. I'm not, you could probably tell by looking at me now, I'm not like,
oh, come on, Nate.
Yeah.
You don't look that bad.
It's been a rough couple months. But I was probably in the best shape of my life. I was eating really clean. I cut out sugar from my diet. I was exercising probably 5 or 6 times a week. And I was just in really good shape, but I was still experiencing some health problems. And despite doing all the best practices, I was like experiencing fatigue and a bunch of other weird symptoms. So I went to the doctor, and the doctor's like, let's do some tests. And he recommended I go get a colonoscopy. And maybe this is an overshare. I apologize if it is. But they did a colonoscopy, and because I have a history of colon cancer in my family, and they found some big polyps that were precancerous. And it made me realize, like, despite doing all the best practices, sometimes there are health issues that are going on that are invisible to the naked eye. There are things going on under the surface that you can't detect unless you have the right tools and the right systems in place. And I feel like win-loss analysis is like, it's like the CT scan. It's like the X-ray. It's the tool that you can use in your business, despite doing all the best practices, to find the invisible problems that are going on and take care of them so they don't kind of eat away at the efficiency and overall health of your organization. So last week we talked about mining for gold and how win-loss analysis is kind of like being a modern day prospector. And today I want you to think about win-loss analysis as maybe the tool that you use, the only tool that you can really use to find and solve the hidden revenue problems that are posing a threat to the overall health of your business that you may not see on the surface. Does that
Totally.
feel like a fair analogy?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
I
can
think
you
so.
can validate me now. You can tell me how
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
that
I
was.
mean, we often use the analogy that, our goal is to diagnose, not necessarily to prescribe. Think of us as like the Mayo Clinic, we're expert diagnostic people. So that's, to bring the analogy further, I think there's a lot of situations where people, they might believe that they're doing everything right, like Nate said, but there's something under the surface that's going on that's really causing some issues in your go-to-market plan. So that's what we try to focus on and what we try to correct for.
Fantastic.
I'll take it. I'm going to take the analogy and run with it as well. Sometimes people have an hypothesis of what's going on, and you could think of that as, you have fatigue, you go to WebMD, you say like, what possibly could be wrong with me? And you get all these different, diagnoses back of like, what could it be? And we'll tell you. So we'll be like the doctor. So I think just going along with that, your hypothesis is like WebMD, let's validate it or debunk it.
Yes. So if you do go to your doctor because you're experiencing some pains, or you go to WebMD, go to Google and start searching, which I don't always advise because it always ends up as worst case scenario.
Yeah.
But the first thing your doctor is going to do is start asking you questions, right? He's going to try and understand your symptoms, where they started, how long you've had them, and probably start putting together a map in his mind to help diagnose the problem. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. After you've picked a revenue problem to solve, the next thing is we want to figure out how to go to our buyers and start asking them the right questions so that we can start putting together a plan to address the issue. And so today we're going to be talking about how to build an interview guide. And I guess my first question is, why is an interview guide even important? Why should we be putting together like a plan or an outline for when we jump on a call with a buyer to start investigating these problems?
Yeah. Good question. I think, you've got to go in with a plan, and it's like the doctor, that doctor's gone to medical school. They might not have an actual checklist. I've actually been to the doctor where they have a checklist. Like, I need to ask you all these questions. It just guides your discussion and makes it a lot more efficient. If you don't, then you're going to waste a lot of time fumbling around and not really knowing what to do. So it's helping you get at the root of the problem, but it's also just making sure that you're spending your time most effectively in the interview. So I would say that's a key reason it's important. Just, if you're prepared, you're going to do okay.
Yeah. I would echo that. It's a lot about preparation and being respectful. The buyers that jump on the call with you, this is not their full-time job. They're taking time out of their day to spend 30 minutes to give you insight on your business and what it was how they made their decision. And so I think there's a component of you coming prepared is a way to show your respect to those buyers and that this is important to you and you do value them giving up their time. I also think there's a component of, as you're preparing the interview guide, you get the opportunity to really sit and think on the question that you're trying to solve. And that allows you to be more adaptive and dynamic in your conversations while having a structured way to go about that. So if you need to do deep dive questions and follow-up questions, you can be more intentional about where you're driving that deeper conversation.
That's great advice. And just full disclosure, we're using essentially an interview guide right now. Like, we've pre-planned how we want this conversation to go. And I'm planning to ask you guys specific questions that will lead us to the result that we're looking for, right?
Yeah. So the listeners can judge the effectiveness of our interview guide by how this goes.
Yeah. I know part of having an interview guide, just even for today, is just like not having nerves.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
It can be really nerve-wracking to go in blind to a conversation like this and not know exactly where you're starting or where you want to go. And so especially if you're doing win-loss analysis for the first time, if you're interviewing buyers in this way for the first time, I think it can also be a real help to like just calm your nerves a little bit and not make you feel so nervous on the call. Like, oh, I have a plan, I'll just follow the plan.
Yeah, totally. If you're talking about a topic that you know so well that you don't need a guide, then maybe you don't need it, right? But going back to the doctor, right? If it's a common set of symptoms, they don't need to look at some checklist. They know exactly what to ask, and then they can quickly prescribe what needs to be done.
Awesome.
But in the case where you're talking about something new or something pretty technical, like we have a lot of clients that we work with where I'm not just going to try to wing it when I'm talking about cybersecurity, like I need to know all of the different nuances of the things that I need to ask about, because I'm talking to really intelligent technical people, and they're going to want me to be using the jargon correctly.
Yeah.
Perfect. So as we're moving into building our interview guide, do you have any advice on how to structure this guide? What are some just basic things that we should keep in mind?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I always think of when people talk about this, I always think about the movie Pirates of the Caribbean, where he talks about the pirate's code. And he said the code is more like guidelines than actual rules.
Oh, okay, I see where you're going.
Yeah, I know. You were like, this is a stretch. But it really is. These are guidelines, not actual rules. And I would think of your interview guide somewhat like that, right? Like there's some best practices, but it needs to be adapted to your main situation. I think one of the things is you want to really focus your guide around main topics. That allows some flexibility, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But there's some core topics that you want to discuss if you're talking to, some sort of business to business, like SaaS or financial services or healthcare type transaction situation. You want to talk about marketing, you want to talk about sales, you want to talk about the product offering, but maybe it's not a product business, so you'll focus more on the service. But anyway, there's some main topics that you want to think about as your core bones, if you will, for how to structure the guide.
Yeah.
Cool.
And just to carry that on, structuring your interview guide, around main topics also is a little bit of thinking ahead. So when you're going through and doing the transcripts and trying to get the insights out of these interviews that you're doing, it's a lot of qualitative content. So having those main topics allows you to sort of break down the transcripts and allows people, as you're going through, if you have a product section, they can sort of focus on the product section. It's not going to be perfect because conversations sort of go where conversations will go, but it does help you find, the section that may be most relevant to you.
Yeah, definitely. And then beyond that, I think there's a couple of layers within each section. You want to have what I refer to as headline questions. So these questions these are the most important things that you want to ask pretty much every time, right? Because you believe that they're going to extract the most information. So it kind of goes back to what we talked about last week with the revenue problem. If you have a revenue problem, well, what do you need to know to really find out about that revenue problem? And I think within each section, you want to start fairly high level and fairly open-ended, and then drill down into more specific. Like you might ask in a product section, you might say something as open-ended and somewhat vague as, tell me about what you thought about the product, right? And then you might get to questions like, tell me about the API functionality, right? When you're going a level deeper, or tell me about this specific aspect of the user experience. So that's kind of the flow, as you think open-ended, and then you go down to a little bit more closed-ended and specific as you go along. But the open-ended things allow you to see what are the types of things people are saying unaided with not a lot of really specific feedback. I think some of the things that we hear a lot from our clients is they want really super specific feedback on particular product features. And when you ask people about that, they don't even know, right? Like it wasn't even part of what they evaluated. So it's good to start open-ended just to see what did make an impression. Like what were the things that made a difference to people. And then underneath those headline questions is what we call optional drill downs. So the optional drill downs are basically things like, okay, so you thought these were particular weaknesses. Why did that affect your decision? Was it material to your use case? Other things that you might want to know to really identify, are these things that really mattered in the decision that was made or not? One of the things that I think is so frustrating to see, and sometimes like when people are new to doing this, they often will skip the optional drill downs. Some people will ask a question like, so tell me about, pricing concerns. And they'll say, oh yeah, I thought the price was too high. And then the next question they ask will be, oh, so what did you think about the sales rep? It's like, well, price is too high. What does that mean? Like, was it like, did you have a particular budget in mind? Did you have something else that you really needed to know about that wasn't surfacing there? Like there's so many drill down questions that you can ask as a result of that. So it really helps to have that in your guide. So you have the arrows in your quiver per se to ask those type of questions when a really interesting answer comes up from a headline question.
Cool.
Yeah. Agreed. And just one more thing on that is I would always bring it back to what's the objective? Like, what revenue problem are we trying to address here? And have a focus under each of those like main topics or categories, so that as you're headlining questions, you're not diverse, like trying to answer too much. You want to keep it focused. So if you're asking about, just to go off Jonathan's example, pricing, and there's a specific piece of the pricing that's important to what you're exploring, that's where you focus and that's where you dig all the inside out. Because you can get into a situation where a buyer has a lot to say about pricing, but maybe there's only one piece that is really important to what you're trying to answer.
That is
good
some
point.
great general advice. So just to kind of encapsulate that or summarize, we want to make sure that we're staying focused on our objective. We want to have some general themes that we want to hit, and then you want to have drill down questions to get more specific around the general items that relate to the overall theme of your interview.
Totally.
Yeah.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So be
It's a great
specific,
summary.
be specific, and then get more specific, and then get most specific. Cool.
And that level of specificity should be adapted to the type of conversation you're having, right? So you want to make sure that those are, the guide is designed to be flexible, because you don't want to get specific on something that somebody doesn't know about. Then you're just going to feel like you're interrogating them and they're going to say, I don't know. Right. So that's an important aspect of it, is keep in mind that you should have levels of specificity that are adapted to the conversation at hand.
Cool. Now, Lauren, I want to get into some common do's and don'ts.
Okay.
I think there are a lot of really simple mistakes that people make, especially if you've never done a win-loss program before. You might be new to it. So can we start talking a little bit about some common do's and some common don'ts when it comes to building out your interview guide?
Yeah. And let's just take it from sort of the beginning of an interview, if you will. So we mentioned that we're using an interview guide today. And as you noticed, Nate did a great introduction. There were some things he wanted to cover off right at the beginning to sort of set the context, set the tone for what we're going to be talking about today. That is one of the things that people forget the most, is to tell people why we're here. So, you know, in your interview guide, you maybe don't need to script it, but just make a note to yourself if this is something newer to you or you haven't done a lot of these. Make a note to sort of set up the purpose of the call. What are you trying to achieve? What is it going to look like? Give the buyer opportunity to ask any questions, or if you can help clarify how the interview is going to be used. Oftentimes there's concerns about, I'm providing you quotes. Are you going to be using these externally? The answer is always no for us. If you're running these internally, maybe that's a different answer, but you'll need to solve that on your own. But it always just gives the buyer a good level setting and understanding of like, how open can I be with my responses? And it makes the conversation more honest.
Totally. And I think on top of that too, if you want to make the interview effective, there is a very base level of trust that has to be established between the interviewee and the person conducting the interview. If you just go straight to the questions, it's going to start the whole thing a little bit uncomfortable. If they start to get comfortable with you, then maybe they're going to be able to divulge a little bit more information that's going to affect your competitive intelligence objective or whatever you're trying to do. Like one question that I try to use, it's not rocket science, but I just say, hey, where are you calling from? And they might say, oh, I'm calling from this place. And some places I get so often that I have like my usual thing that I say. If they say Atlanta, I say, oh, that's great. I'd love to go to Atlanta. I've just never been outside the airport. It almost always falls flat, but you know, it's a conversation starter. Lauren thought it was kind of
Lauren's
funny.
over in the corner listening to, there's the Atlanta joke again.
Yeah, there's the Atlanta joke.
I've only heard it about 1,000 times.
Yeah, exactly.
You must fly Delta.
Yep. So anyway, I think, you know, just building a little bit of rapport at the beginning can go a long way. It doesn't have to take a long time, right? It can take 1 or 2 minutes, but it can go a long way. Yeah.
And you get a feel for it. I mean, some buyers, depending on what the persona is, you know, maybe if they're more technical, they don't really want to talk a whole lot about where they're from. They just do want to dive in. They want you to tell them why they're there, dive in, get the conversation done. Cool. Or if they're a more senior level executive, their time is precious and valuable. But sometimes you get the senior executives, they're like, oh my goodness, thank goodness, a break from my everyday. I'd like to just chat for a few minutes and get to know you. So you get a feel for sort of what your buyer's personality is, right? When you get on the phone and you just try and talk to them within how they want to be talked to.
Cool. Any other tips?
Yeah.
I think that's good. Yeah.
Let's look at our guide.
Yeah. Do make it conditional. Don't make it too rigid. I think we've kind of already talked about it talked about this already. Everybody has, well, at least I have, they get those political opinion polls. To this date, I've never actually finished one because they're way too rigid. And I'm just like, I don't have time for this. I'm bored, because they get you on the phone and they ask the same question every time in the same order. And they ask you multiple choice questions, which over the phone are painful. It's like, A, strongly agree. B, agree. I'm just like, I don't have time for this, right? It's a snoozer. So I think
don't make your interview a survey.
Exactly. Yeah. It should be a conversation, right? And some people take that too far and they think, oh, it doesn't have any structure. Like, that's the whole point of the interview guide, is to create that level of structure. But you should finesse it such that the person on the other end of the line doesn't realize that you have a ton of rigidity to the conversation. Cool.
Yeah. And I think this is where like an interview guide becomes so important, and a secondary softer skill is active listening. You need to be engaged in these conversations, and you need to be really familiar with the interview guide, because if your plan is to go from sort of the overview and origination, then talk about the evaluation, then the competitors, and then the product, and the buyer throws you a loop and starts talking about marketing and how they engage on the website, you need to be able to hear that, adapt to it, go to the marketing section, start covering off on that, and then bring it back to the flow of the conversation that you want to go through to make sure that you're hitting all the points that are important.
It's way easier to do a rigid phone survey type interview than an adapted, really consultative interview. And what Lauren was describing, like, that's a skill that you think at first, oh, this is easy, but it actually is honed over time. You've got to really build that skill set to be able to have an adaptive interview that still accomplishes the objectives that you want.
So if these like really rigid survey type pick A, B, C, D questions are not the type of questions you should be asking, what type of questions are the ideal questions to ask in an interview?
Yeah. I think Jonathan talked about this a bit at the beginning, but or just earlier, open-ended questions, really good. You want to try and not bias them. So you don't want to say like, what did the sales team do poorly? Like, when you start the sales section, you would want to say like, what was your interaction with the sales team like, or something like that? What was your impression of the people that you worked with over at X, Y, and Z? You want to start really open-ended so that you're not putting any assumptions in their mind about good or bad. If they give you poor feedback, say they said, oh, sales rep B was just awful. I hated working with them. But then I got moved over to sales rep A. Like, great. Tell me what happened with sales rep B that didn't work for you. You don't need to make it really negative. You just want to find out a little bit more about what that situation and what didn't work for that particular buyer.
Great example.
Yeah. To that point, like, your goal is not to judge people's answers. If they feel like you're judging them, like in Lauren's example, if they say something negative about sales rep B, you don't want to say, oh, I know sales rep B, he's such a good guy. No, you don't say anything like that. You just say, hey, thanks for the feedback. That's helpful. Tell me about this. Right. So you can't, or it can be positive, right? If somebody says something that they liked about the product, don't like agree with them and try to upsell them in the interview. That's not the whole point of this. It's to be a neutral information collector that's just extracting information out of somebody.
Yeah.
Awesome. Are there any open-ended questions that are like favorites of yours that you might tease to our audience?
So many.
Yeah.
Give me one or two that just gives another example, because I think talking about the principles is really great. Like, when people see examples, that it kind of clicks, like, okay, that's what they mean by that.
Yeah. My favorite question is not a winner 100% of the time. However, when you do get information from it, it is very valuable. So my favorite question is when you're talking about pricing and talking about sort of the sales pitch and what was the value, you want to ask about if the buyer either had to sell the value internally or had to like wrap their head around the value of the product, what were the points that they pulled into that value case that they presented to internal stakeholders or that they made for themselves to justify the cost? It works about 50% of the time. Sometimes people don't have an answer or a really thought out answer to that because it's either something they just needed. It's a, table stakes for the business. But when you do get an answer, it's a really, really powerful answer.
Yeah. I like that one. I like that one a lot. One that I like a lot, and this is, for specific situations, so often, especially when you're dealing with a smaller, medium-sized business, like a more price-sensitive type buyer, Some of the time what they'll say often is, okay, so why didn't you buy product XYZ? And they'll say, oh, price, it was too expensive. And then sometimes like you keep asking them different questions, you try to get more nuance out of that, and they just keep going to price. And so one of the strategies that I've used is to ask hypothetical type questions where I say, okay, look, you were evaluating product A and product B. Obviously, product A was less expensive. You chose product A, and you're saying the reason we chose it was because it was less expensive. But let's just take a step back for a second, and let's imagine that the prices were exactly the same. The packaging situation was exactly the same. Would you have made the same decision? And then it causes them to really reflect. And I will tell you, in the majority of cases, they will reveal things that you didn't know before, and you'll realize it wasn't just about price.
Yeah.
It was really about other things. Price is such a perception-based thing. There's, it's not black and white. I mean, so often a good salesperson, if they've built the value enough, they can make the buyer think that the price is totally reasonable, whereas a bad salesperson would not. So I think asking some of those type of hypothetical questions, like if you had done this, or if these conditions were present, if they say something like, yeah, our company got bought and the acquiring company just said, you have to use this product. Well, okay, let's say your company didn't get bought and you needed to evaluate this product anyway. How would you have made that decision? And so sometimes it really requires people to pressure test their own thought process as to how they made the decision when you ask those type of hypotheticals.
Awesome.
Yeah. And we've used price a lot as an example. That works for anywhere in the interview guide. So,
Yep.
sales process feedback, product feedback, those hypotheticals are a great way to uncover additional information that maybe the buyer isn't even thinking about or wasn't going to share because, the business said that they made the decision on price.
Yeah, totally.
Great. So we had a question come in from, I believe it was Lisa, and she said, I love that question. Can you please say it again? I don't know which question she was referring to. So could you both repeat your favorite open-ended questions for Lisa, just so we have it on record?
Yeah, we kind of did a little preamble to these questions, so it might have been,
right.
it might have gotten lost. So yeah, Lauren, you can go first.
Yeah. So my question was around the value, and I would ask it. I would have first probably a warm-up question just to make sure I'm asking something that's relevant. So I would ask something like, did you have to sell the value of this product or this vendor internally to other stakeholders? If yes, then I would follow up and say, tell me a little bit about the value case that you built, and what components did you use to sell that internally to stakeholders?
It's such a great question because B2B situations, there's never one decision maker, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's got to convince somebody else.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So my question was basically, if the price of two offerings was exactly the same, would your decision have been the same?
Yeah.
And that's usually followed when somebody is saying price is a main issue. So
Great.
there you go, Lisa.
I have one more comment on the hypothetical because I feel like sometimes this is something that doesn't always happen, but prior bias coming into the buying decision process.
Mm-hmm.
This is another great place where hypotheticals can help you uncover how much impact a prior bias had. So say our buyer had experience with vendor A. They come into this evaluation and vendor A is in that evaluation again, and their prior experience was really negative. You can ask hypotheticals to uncover like how much did they do to try and prevent that bias from impacting the indecision. Sometimes buyers will do a lot and bring in other stakeholders that are not biased. And sometimes they don't even try. And they just say, that was a terrible experience. I needed 3 vendors. They were in there, but they were never in the running.
Yeah, totally. Or the other end of the spectrum, right?
Right.
Like they'll bring a vendor in and it's their best friend is one of the sales reps or something like that. And they always intended to buy, but they might have this facade of a competitive evaluation by bringing in other vendors. So trying to ask those hypotheticals, say, well, if your best friend wasn't the sales rep at this other company, would you have made that same decision? Yeah.
That's great. Great feedback. So one of the thoughts that I had, we haven't really talked about this, but when we're doing a win-loss interview, we're asking essentially for time and resources from the buyers that we're talking to. And so we don't want to ask for too big of a commitment, like sitting down with us for 90 minutes. to do an
Oh,
interview.
that's a
That's
lot.
like way too long.
Yeah.
So I think here at Clozd, we try to keep it to about 30 minutes, right?
Mhm.
And you can uncover a lot of information in a 30-minute conversation. What are some of the risks that people run if they build the interview guide to be too big? Like, have you ever seen a case where you just want to ask too many questions?
Oh man,
Or...
yeah, boiling the ocean.
Okay, that's a great analogy.
I've seen this. I've seen this before. Basically, people that are really into this, especially people that have like a traditional market research type background, they want to just get as much information as they possibly can. There's a delicate balance though, because the reason that we have landed on 30 minutes as the ideal time is because when you ask for more time, the amount of people that are going to be willing to give you that time drops dramatically. So
Yeah.
part of this is just, it's not just the content of the interviews, it's also the volume of interviews that you're getting.
The responsiveness.
And the responsiveness. Like, you're going to get a lower response rate if you ask for more time, and you're going to probably have to ask for, I don't know, you're probably going to have to remunerate people somehow, right? So 30 minutes is good. The other thing is keeping the time limit in mind. You want to make sure that your guide is designed for that time limit. I was working with a client once, and basically we gave them a template. We made some customizations to it. We said, hey, solicit this with some stakeholders, see what they come back with. They came back with something that was 20 pages long for a 30-minute interview.
It's a little much.
And I was like, a little much, geez. And so I was like, this isn't gonna work. And basically what they did is, it was a little bit conditional. Like, some sections were just for certain products, so I wouldn't be going over the whole thing, but it was so unwieldy, just tactically, I couldn't get to all the answers. And the other thing was, a lot of this, they were asking questions that were so specific that most of the people I asked, they just said, we didn't really evaluate that particular product feature. So it's a good level of self-awareness to think, like, what do we think is important as creators of these products or as creators of this company? And what do our buyers actually perceive? Because sometimes the things that we think are so important and we want to stuff into this interview guide, were not even a consideration in the evaluation. So I guess that all that said, make sure that your questions are suited to the amount of time that you have. You probably want to have a little bit longer than the time you have, so you have options of questions to ask in certain scenarios. But 20 pages, that's a little rich.
It's too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good to know.
And to go along with that, we talked about open-ended questions, but just be intentional. Try not to keep too many demographic questions in your interview guide. If it's something that can be like data collection or go into a data field and isn't really very qualitative, or
Don't waste your time on it.
Yeah, unless it's really material or you're not able to get that information any other way, we advise to leave those out.
Yeah.
And then, just one more time about asking questions. This is not like I'm going to read question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4, like through the interview guide. There is a tendency to want to do that to make qualitative feedback more digestible. But if you're taking the interviews and able to like pull the themes out of them, then they will be digestible.
Fantastic. Okay, I want to jump on to, actually, I want to hit this last point right here about not all buyers are the same.
Oh yeah.
So when you're interviewing people, you might be interviewing an executive one moment, and then the next you might be interviewing like the internal champion. You might be interviewing people in a bunch of different roles and a bunch of different capacities.
Yeah.
How would you adapt the guide based off of role? Is that an important thing to do? And if so, why?
Yeah. So, maybe less about role and more about just recognizing that every buyer is different. Even if you have,
Good correction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, because even within roles, people are different, right? You're not personality type A and you get role like
Totally.
C, right? So, I think there's a tendency from a marketing perspective to think about your personas and think like, okay, we have this persona, this person fits in that persona. So they have these qualities, X, Y, and Z. This is how they think. And while that's great from like a general marketing way and gives you like great guidance and direction, when you're having these one-to-one interactions, you might end up asking questions that really are not relevant for that particular buyer. So for example, say you have, 3 stakeholders, we get an interview with one of them, and that one was really the person who was closer to the budget and who was helping to gosh, we've used pricing a lot. Sorry. We're just going to use this
It's
one
a
again.
common objective that people want to learn more about. So that makes sense.
It is. Yeah. So, and that person happens to be really close to the pricing. We could have gotten one of the other two stakeholders and say one of the other stakeholders was more technical and was helping to evaluate against technical requirements or business requirements that the company had, and made a really great evaluation framework and ran all the scoring and helped like bring all the scores together from the different stakeholders. That person's not going to be able to answer the pricing questions as robustly as the person who was handling the pricing section of the evaluation.
Totally. And I mean, there's a question of use case too. Like the way people use different products is totally different. If somebody is a decision maker, often they are not the main user of whatever they're buying. Maybe people that report to them are. So it's interesting to get the perspectives of those different type of people. And I mean, there's a bunch of different dimensions that will affect people's answers. It might be geography or cultural background or whatever. So it's important to be sensitive to the nuances of how different people might perceive different questions.
Which goes back to the active listening and being really familiar with your interview guide. This is why we make them, so that we can be prepared for these situations.
Yep.
Yeah, I think one of the obstacles that, if you've never built an interview guide before, that you might face today or this next week as you go out to build your interview guide, is the pressure to make it perfect. Like, I need to build out the perfect interview guide. Before I can go into an interview, I need to make sure it's super polished and that there's not going to be any mistakes, that it's not too long, that it's not too short, that the questions are perfect. And I think that's a big mistake that people can make. That's why the homework today is not to create the perfect interview guide, it's to create the first draft. And I think, why do you think that's important, to just focus on a first draft right now, as opposed to like getting everything perfect?
Well, the intention of the interviews are to uncover stuff you don't know. So how can you ask questions about something you don't know?
Yeah.
And so as you're going through these interviews, you're going to learn. And as you learn, you want to put those learnings back into the interview guide. So say the hypothesis, somebody was really concerned about APIs and integrations as part of their product offering. They felt like they were losing to a lot of competitors based on their limited integrations. And we get in there and we find out that's not the case at all. Like, it's actually this other feature or product functionality, or maybe like the sales team is too aggressive or something like that. We want to be able to dig into those areas and uncover what is that? And so, if APIs and integrations aren't the focus, maybe we pull those back a little bit. We reduce the number of questions around that and dig into those other areas.
Yeah. Being dynamic about it is really important, because you, like Lauren said, you don't know what you don't know. So you'll learn things as you go along, and you'll realize that certain questions aren't giving you the answers that you expected. So change the questions. Make sure, if things aren't working, stop asking that. Or if you need to dig in on something else, have 2 or 3 more questions on that particular topic.
Good points.
Yeah.
Now, there might be a little bit of anxiety once we get our first draft put together of like, oh, is this good enough? Like, is this presentable? Can I take this to a buyer and really use these questions? What advice do you have to maybe reassure a first-time interviewer that their buyer guide is kind of sufficient? It's in a good place to go dive into a buyer interview for the first time.
Yeah. So something that you definitely need to do, and not just for the sake of the interview guide, but for other reasons as well, you need to solicit the guide with other key stakeholders. So when you're doing this, if you just keep it to yourself and you just create this yourself, there won't be, couple things. You won't get the questions in there that other departments and other people in the organization really want asked. So that's a key thing. I mean, typically you want to talk to somebody in product, somebody in sales, somebody in marketing, somebody in competitive intelligence. Those are other people that you could talk to as well. But you'll get better questions. I would advise to make sure you don't end up in the trap that I just talked about with the 20-page guide. Let them know, like, provide a framework for the type of feedback they give. Say, if you want to add a question, maybe give a suggestion on a question to take away to this.
I'm going to be interviewing buyers specifically about our pricing, or specifically about integrations. Do you have any questions about that you want me to ask?
Totally. Yeah. And questions that are relevant to them. The other ancillary benefit that you'll get from doing this is the more input people have into the preparation for your win-loss program, the more buy-in they will have in terms of the outcomes of your win-loss program. I've seen this done in silos. And then when people show the results, they're like, well, the questions you asked were stupid. Why should I care about that? But if they crafted the questions initially, they're going to be like, oh, this is what I really wanted to know. And now I have 20 people that told me what they thought about it. This is really useful. And I've seen that work well and poorly. And it really depends on who you get on your side when you're doing the win-loss program, because this is not just a one-person show.
Yeah.
Cool. Lauren, when you're soliciting feedback from some of these internal stakeholders, are there, Jonathan mentioned a couple of mistakes to avoid, like don't let them just submit any question that they want. Let's keep it focused. Are there any other issues that maybe you should be aware of when you're taking feedback from other internal stakeholders?
Oh yeah. I always give the guidelines when we're circulating our interview guides internally at a client. I give some guidelines for review, and I sort of have, I think there's 3 of them. So let's see if I can hit them all. Nate has them nicely outlined for me behind the screen. So the first one would be, you want to keep it focused on the objective. So Jonathan was talking about that. But what that can also do, apart from just getting like ownership from these different stakeholders and really getting buy-in from it, it can set you up for your next objective. So if right now we're focused on pricing and you bring in some of these other stakeholders and say competitive intelligence is like, yeah, but we really want to know about product. You say like, great, for these first 20 interviews, like we're going to do pricing. Maybe for the next set of interviews, we do product questions, right? And we really dig in there. So it gives you sort of a roadmap of how to do win-loss and, bundle your insights so that you're not trying to go after too much with this first set of interviews. You also want to be careful that you don't spend a ton of time wordsmithing. If you ask people to review the interview guide and they spend, an hour and a half going through questions, picking them apart, saying, you said, how do we do this? Maybe we said what instead. And they sit there and they wordsmith and they spend a lot of time doing that. And then those questions aren't asked exactly that way. It's going to feel like a waste of time for them. So wordsmithing, not advised.
And the other thing that wordsmithing has a tendency to do is you tend to, if they're over doctored, the questions end up sounding really not like natural speech.
Very robotic.
It's like the type
Very
of thing
robotic.
that might be in a survey, but you would never use in a real conversation. So when you're doing the interview, you're not going to word a question that way anyway.
Yeah. Exactly. So as we said, these are guidelines. Like we ask the questions in the interview guide. We rarely use them word for word. What's more helpful is for stakeholders to put a comment maybe in the margin of why that question is interesting to them and what they're hoping to learn from it. That also helps guide our follow-up and deep dive questions after we do the headliner question. And then the third bullet point for review that I would say is that you want to make sure that the language is what your buyers are expecting. So if we are in, industry A and they talk about, instead of, gosh, I'm blanking on an example.
Cybersecurity. That's my go-to for something really obscure and technical.
Yeah. You want to make sure that you're using jargon that you would hear in that industry. So, if
it's like in education, sorry, I'm going to jump over. I just had this conversation with somebody.
Okay.
It's like if you're talking to somebody about a business case in the business world, and then you go over to education, you're not going to use the word business case to describe what they're doing. And there's a whole different lingo for the education market, or maybe the fintech market, or than there is for like the B2B SaaS companies.
Yeah, that's a great example.
You want to make sure that you're speaking the language of the person that you're interviewing and not like overwhelming them with technobabble or terms that aren't relevant to them,
or terms that are company specific, right? Every company has their own internal jargon.
Like we use the term decision drivers, and I don't like it's understandable what that is, but you might want to break it down and say, hey, these are the things that influence buyer decisions.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Cool. Those are great tips. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So we have spent about 45 minutes here talking your ears off. Lauren and Jonathan, between the two of them, have conducted thousands of buyer interviews. There are a few people on the planet who have done more interviews than these two people here. And so they have a lot of experience understanding how to approach buyers, how to engage with them, how to conduct a really successful, not only win-loss interview, but a win-loss program to lead them. And so you've really gotten some amazing advice, maybe fire hosed with a lot of advice. I hope you took a lot of notes today. And I want to just dial it back just a little bit, bring it back and remind you what today's assignment is. You got a lot of best practices, a lot of tips, but all we want you to do in the next 7 days before you come back again for part 3 of Win-Loss 101 is build out your very first draft of a buyer interview guide. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be a home run. It just needs to be something that will get you through a 30-minute conversation with that's focused around the problem that you have chosen to solve throughout the 6-week program that we're doing here, and that has some drill down questions underneath each main question to help you get the solutions. We'd love it if you would jump over to winloss101.com and share your interview guide with us. We might invite some of our consultants in to take a look at them and give you some advice. If you want to hit these guys up on LinkedIn, I'm sure they're more than happy to maybe answer some one-on-one questions if they're not barraged.
Totally.
They're busy, but they're also willing to help and talk about this stuff. So that wraps up our lesson portion. We have had a couple of questions come in while we've been talking that I want to address for the next 5, maybe 10 minutes max. Some of them will be pretty easy. Some of them might take a little bit of thought on your part. And I'll put them up on the screen for those of you who are watching live so you can see. The first one is an easy one. I'll answer it. It's from Rodrigo. He says, can you also share the experiences to convince buyers to talk to you? I'm assuming that once you overcome the sales team barrier to get the contact information and stuff like that, the next one is you have to get the buyer to talk to you.
It's a softball.
It's a softball. Next week, this is literally the topic of the session. It's how to get a list of contacts, and then we're going to give you some templates and some counsel and advice on how to actually get people to respond and sign up, book time to talk to you. So we're going to spend an entire lesson next week answering Rodrigo's question. So if you want to know the answer, we invite you to come back next week. You can live stream it on LinkedIn or YouTube, or go to winloss101.com and you'll find the lesson there. Does that answer that question for now?
Yeah.
Jonathan's like, I want to say more. I want to say more.
I want to, but I know that
it is a 45-minute answer.
It's a 45-minute answer, right? There's some best practices. We actually have our experts doing that next week.
Yeah.
So you're going to get more from them. So I'll use self-restraint and
they've done some awesome research, and they have some really cool tips and tricks that they'll be giving you. So we're really excited about that.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to acknowledge that question was asked and make sure that people have a way to get the answer next week. The next question that I have is a two-parter. The first part is from Lisa, and she says, how do we win against our number one competitor? And then Rodrigo kind of piggybacked on that and said, yes, Lisa, +1, but mine is focused on a competitor in a specific country. And Lisa said that is great refinement. So if you want to learn more information about a specific competitor, and maybe that specific competitor is in a specific geographic geographic area, or I'm sure there's other ways to kind of parse that out. But what advice would you all have in overall in a win-loss perspective, but also maybe with putting together a interview guide to investigate a competitor?
Yeah. Good question.
Those are great questions.
Yeah, couple of pieces of advice. So on the theme of crafting the interview guide, we always have a section called competitor or competitors. And often what we'll do within that section is we'll make it conditional. So if you have ascertained through the process of the interview that one or two competitors was the runner-up or the winner in an evaluation, then have questions that you're going to ask specifically about that competitor. Sometimes some of those questions might work for any competitor, but you might have a hypothesis as to why those competitors are winning in your space. So have questions that you ask about that. The other thing is, and the other thing is beyond the interview guide, it comes back to some data hygiene issues.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you can have your sellers include who they think the main competitor was in an evaluation when they're closing out a deal in your CRM, then you can just focus your outreach to people that evaluated that particular competitor. Sometimes, and this goes to the next question, sometimes it is semi-regional, right? So you'll find within a region of a country or in a particular country, there will be one competitor that if you're trying to sell in that country, that competitor is almost always the one that's present. So that can give you a clue. So I think, it's the questions and how you craft the guide, but it's also who you target. You want to focus on the people that you either evaluated that competitor, or that based on other clues, you think were most likely to have evaluated that competitor based on the situation. It might not be geography. It might be just the size of the business. Like we have a particular client where in their upmarket segment, there's like 3 main competitors. And in their downmarket segment, there's, 2 or 3 main competitors. So that if you're doing a downmarket deal, you're likely to encounter one of those competitors, and you can ask them, okay, what did you think of this competitor? How did they differentiate themselves from your product, et cetera?
Perfect.
I think I'll keep it within the confines of an interview guide, or try to anyway, because I'm going to say something about lists, data hygiene. But I think when you're thinking about building the interview guide and you're trying to learn how are you positioned against a competitor, or why is that competitor excelling in a region or area that you're not, you want to think about it not just within the competitor section of the interview guide. You want to think about it across every section. You may have a hypothesis, but what if it's like the way the way buyers are finding that competitor? So like in the overview and origination section, you want to understand how each vendor ended up in the evaluation. In the product section, what were the key requirements that they were evaluating against? What did that framework look like? And then how did each vendor score if there was top 2 or 3? And so you want to do it in every single section. Maybe there's a marketing component, or maybe the sales reps, they said that, oh, I got along with the sales rep from company B so much better. Like, well, what does better mean? Why was that sales rep? Why did you connect with them so much better than the sales rep from our company? And you want to understand, like, how did that sales rep, how were they able to build a better relationship with that buyer? And so you really want to break the bounds and make your whole interview guide about like comparing and contrasting each step of the journey with that competitor.
Yeah. And to piggyback on that, Lauren, so often the first thing people go to is like product comparisons. They say, oh, well, that competitor has these particular features in their product, and that's what people like. I've seen a lot of situations where, sometimes that is the case, right? But
not as often as you'd think.
Not as often as you think. And I think there's so many situations where I've seen where a competitor has an inferior product, but they're just way better at selling it.
Yeah.
And so, that's something that you can capture through doing these kind of interviews. So asking questions in the sales process, like, what was your impression of the sales rep? Did they offer some sort of free trial? It's the process of how people become aware and gain perceptions of the product that's as important as the product itself.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, if you're watching right now and you want somebody like Lauren to conduct your win-loss interviews for you,
here's the shameless sales plug.
Well, it's not a plug. Like, we want to help you be successful in your win-loss analysis efforts. And so we're giving away 3 free win-loss analysis interviews. And all you have to do is complete the first 3 homework assignments here at Win-Loss 101. So the first one is to pick a revenue problem. The second one now is to build out your interview guide. And then next week, we're going to teach you how to pull a list of relevant contacts and reach out to them. And if you can accomplish those 3 things, next week we'll tell you how you can redeem those 3 interviews. And Lauren very well may be the person who conducts your 3 free interviews. So if you're impressed with her genius, or Jonathan Stevens' genius here, or anybody else like Cam Turnbow last week, like, these people are brilliant. They're amazing at what they do. And not only will it be really cool to like see how a really experienced win-loss analysis practitioner does an interview, you'll get to check out the recordings and the transcripts, but you'll also get to see how powerful it can be to have all of this win-loss data collected in one place, and you can start pulling out themes and reporting on our platform. And that's a really cool thing to do. So make sure that you take advantage of it. Go to winloss101.com. I plugged that a lot today because that's where all the details are. So just go there and sign up, and that's where you'll find the homework assignments, how you can complete them, and then how you can kind of redeem that next week is when we'll be able to start making those redemptions.
Yeah. It's a good deal. Lauren's good. She'll do great interviews for you.
And the value of that.
He'll do great interviews for you.
So we're grateful for all of you who tuned in and hung out with us today. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week, Friday, same time, same place. Winloss101.com if you want the details. Thank you, Lauren and Jonathan, for joining us today and sharing so much of your amazing knowledge about how to build an interview guide and talk to buyers. It was really awesome learning from you. I learned a lot.
Thanks, Nate.
Thank you.